Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forgotten Generation podcast, hosted by Troy Njenje Mbanga. This podcast is about amplifying young people's voices and the journeys they're on. Today's episode, to kickstart season 3, is a guest who is a youth activist and a co-chair of our movement. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, such an honour to be on the Forgotten Generation podcast. I remember when Troy first launched it, it was always a goal of mine to be able to share a little bit about my story on here. And now I'm really excited that I'm able to do that, so thank you, Troy. As Troy described, I suppose I'm well known for being a youth activist or change maker. I like that word as well. Most people know me through the I Will movement, both as an ambassador but then transitioning to co-chair last year. But I also think that for me this year, I want to be a lot more intentional with my identity. So beyond those things, at my core, I'm just someone like you. I'm someone that's listening, and I care about humans. I care about other people and the world around us, and I just want to work in collaboration with as many humans as possible to reimagine and build new systems for a more just society where everyone feels like they belong. And I think when we introduce us as activists or change makers, sometimes that comes with a lot of jargon and people don't necessarily understand what that means. So I think I'm trying to be more intentional with that. But yeah, that's who I am. And yeah, I'm a human too.
I love that. We should definitely take that on board this year. So just thank you so much, Molly, for your introduction. And it's so good to have you on the episode today. What is your, and your youth social action?
Yeah, so when I thought about this, I thought again quite intentionally about how I wanted to answer. I didn't realise that I was doing youth social action until I found the I Will movement. And I think a lot of young people in this space also don't realise it. Like many people, and young people, my social action came from a lived experience of injustice and a desire to change things for future generations around me and in my local town and wider society. And I became an I Will ambassador in 2022, which is about 4 years ago now, which is crazy. And initially, I labelled myself and my social action as youth loneliness. And at the time, that's what best spoke for me and my journey. And loneliness was something that I personally lived through, and I breathed it every day, both as an experience but also through advocacy and campaigning. And there was also a lot of national and government mobilisation around it at the time. So I just felt that for me to achieve the things that I wanted to achieve, that was the label that I wanted to use. And as I experienced loneliness, I really struggled to feel present with people, and I felt really invisible around those. Even though I was physically in space with other humans and other friends, I was lacking that feeling of belonging, and this started to impact my physical and mental health quite severely. And then through research and through campaigning and started to advocate via Instagram and online and the digital sphere through government campaigning, I realised that over 2 million young people of similar age to us, 16 to 25, experience loneliness every single day. For me, that was a really empty feeling, and I just couldn't fathom that there were another 2 million young people feeling like this, and how for some people that would have been even worse than perhaps I was experiencing it. So that's kind of how I started getting into campaigning around loneliness and why and how I felt lonely. But then as I explored my journey through I Will and through other opportunities in the youth sector, people started to ask me why I felt lonely. So they acknowledged that I felt lonely, which was one thing, but then they started to ask the question of why. And for some people with their social action, it's quite obvious, whether it be because you're campaigning about mental health, it's quite obvious that perhaps you've lived through that. But for loneliness, it's something quite new for people. And so they started to be more curious, which I was quite grateful for. And this kind of led me onto a journey of kind of rediscovering my identity, and I'm still actively on that journey. And up until that point, I hadn't really realised or shared the deeper story behind it. And so actually, the last couple of years, particularly last year, as I transitioned to co-chair, I started to think about my social action journey, not from I Will, but from beforehand and where that came from. And I started to realise that my journey started when I was around age of 6 to 7, which actually for some people won't be something that is unheard of. A lot of social action starts to develop around that age without the label. And that was because I grew up in a really unsafe family environment. And at the same time, I went through family court, which is a really heavy process to go through. And unfortunately, due to authorities around me, I wasn't safeguarded properly, and I should have actually been removed from that situation. But as a result, I kind of was stuck in that situation for most of my adolescence and teenage years until I was an adult. During this time, when I was 6 to 7, 8 years old, that's when the Syrian civil war broke out, and I saw refugees and their stories on my TV screen, and I felt really strong a really strong familiarity with their experiences of unsafety and trauma. Despite not being a refugee myself, I had that huge empathy and just felt like our stories were intertwined to some extent. And at the time, I couldn't speak up about my own family situation, but what I did was then channel that energy into fundraising for the Syrian refugees at school and educating my fellow peers about it. And I became really passionate about helping others, and I felt that by channeling the hurt and the trauma that I'd gone through had actually been repurposed and packaged up. And I think the most special thing that I've carried throughout with me on all of my social action projects, whether it be loneliness, more activism now, looking at family and social care work, to previously when I worked on the Syrian refugee crisis, was that I really enjoyed building community, camaraderie and education. And it gave me such a purpose and really showed me the path I was meant to go down. And I realised that I was born almost as a person meant to create safe enough spaces for people to learn, to unlearn and share experiences and mobilise. And so my social action has definitely evolved over time, but I think I want to reinforce that anyone that's listening here, that that's okay. And at my core, I'm still Molly. I'm still someone that really cares deeply about humanness and empathy and creating spaces where other people can lead with empathy too. And I think, I just wanted to relay that message to anyone that's listening, that perhaps their social action journey has changed too. That is okay, but as long as you remember where you've come from and your values, that's all that matters.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's so inspiring on what you said. But you've built so much in yourself and inspired so much in people, and to never lose yourself and be the authentic self that you are. And you've come a long way and given your and past experiences, and I think that's just so moving, and I hope listeners can really take away on what Andrew said. And so who inspired you to have a voice in the first place?
I actually think that it's quite cliche of me, but as a lot of people say, definitely my younger self. For me personally, and not many people know this about me, but I have a really strong gut intuition. I think it's like a gift that I've been born with, because I often take the most difficult path, even when advice is against it, or even though it becomes really exhausting. But I do that because I trust my inside, and that I know that I only have myself, to trust entirely in this world. And I've always done that, particularly through the events of my life that have been very difficult. I've only ever had myself to rely on. And despite going through the difficult journey and sometimes questioning my choices and sometimes feeling regret, which obviously that's a natural human emotion to feel, I always come out the other side having learnt something or unlearnt something about myself or people or the situation, the environment for the future. And despite, going through the trauma and teenage mental health problems and still unfortunately experiencing mental health problems as an adult, and then also transitioning into adult and becoming more independent, I've never forgotten my roots. And through my social action and sort of community journey, I've managed to reclaim my power after once feeling powerless. So even though the lived experience I've gone through has at some stages and for some moments in time felt like a never ending feeling of powerlessness, I've managed to flip that and turn it into something really powerful. And so I think that's why I choose myself, and particularly my younger self, as who inspired me to have a voice and who I am today. Because ultimately I do the things I'm doing, to heal parts of myself and give back to those children, young people, or even adults that have experienced something very similar, that understand and empathise with what I've gone through, and I can also empathise with them and help them and the environments around them change to make sure that, no one should go through those things. But even if you have to, then that you can come out the other side of it, which a lot of people don't realise. And I think particularly around the age of 21, which is when I felt really lonely, and that's how it kind of links to my initial social action journey, is that in 2021 I became estranged from my family. And that was one of the hardest decisions I've ever had to make in my life, particularly as we're social beings and there's so much that involves family making and in our society, in narrative, in stories, and every part of, society kind of reinforces that. So not only was it one of the hardest decisions to make, and then another, traumatizing experience because of the way it went, but despite all odds, I really trusted my intuition in that moment, because my intuition and escaping and leaving my family and becoming estranged was a choice to break the cycle not only for my younger self, my current self now, but also those yet to come, family members, people in my community, people that have been affected by similar circumstances. So yeah, in summary, I would say myself, really. And at the end of the day, I'm the only one that can voice my own lived experiences.
You can, and I think it's just so humbling on what you said about your younger self and inspired you and to be who you are today. And I think it's so important to like show your younger Molly and be like, yeah, my younger Molly, you can do this, and you can get to where you want to be. Just never give up. It's going to be a rejection, there's going to be times it's going to be hard, but keep going. I know that there's a community out there with like so many other young people who are wanting to make that change. And you touched on about being strained. And so, and was that like a barrier for you in your journey?
That was one of the barriers, of course, because there's not much resource or support for those that are estranged. And I know that a lot of friends of mine who are in a similar situation can speak a lot more onto this. But actually, one of the barriers I wanted to reflect on today, which I think would be more applicable to a lot wider range of audience listening to this, is the lack of boundaries around lived experience. Particularly something sometimes I see in the social justice space and social action space. Some organisations and environments are a lot more well equipped than others for different reasons, but it's something that I've had to learn, unfortunately, through sometimes some painful circumstances and navigate myself. And I wish a lot more young people not only had the support to navigate that barrier, but also professionals knew how to help young people in this space a lot more with that. And I think as young people, we're rarely taught what boundaries are. Especially in the environment that we're speaking about. And often we have to figure it out ourselves. And that's exactly what happened with me. So obviously my advocacy and campaigning is a lot to do with my lived experience. And for many people it is. But for my lived experience particularly, it's quite traumatic and it can trigger for a lot of people, and as well as myself. And so I've, sometimes been in situations during my social action journey where I've shared a little bit too much perhaps, or it's been inappropriate, or I've shared a bit more graphic detail than I should have, and there's been vulnerable people in the room or maybe people that weren't expecting it. And I've also, as a consequence of working through social action that is so tied to my lived experience, which I don't want to change because it is what gives me that drive and motivation. It's also that, especially with trauma survivors, there's a tendency to normalise experiences. So because I always, repeatedly talk about my lived experiences, whether it be through family court or other instances that have happened, it means that it's almost become quite robotic, and I sometimes don't fully feel the pain anymore or the emotion that, drives me, and the emotion of injustice, which to some extent is a good thing because it means that I'm a little bit emotionally detached and not re-triggering myself. But then it also has led me to feel, in the last year, and the other end of the spectrum, where I felt nothing. And people have come up to me and told me about how my story is really inspiring, or, they felt heard and seen through my story but never had a voice to share it yet, or that they felt encouraged to share theirs. And in that moment, I've not really understood what that meant to that other person, and be able to feel the weight or the gravity of what they've just said to me, and like how much influence I've been able to have on people's lives. And reflecting on that, it's been quite difficult because it's meant I haven't been present in the moment, and it's really important, particularly in the space that we're entering at the moment, to keep grounded. And it all links back to our mental health and our well-being. So now, to overcome that barrier, and some people might be interested in this, I'm trying to be more actively conscious of my boundaries and reconnecting with my emotions more safely. And obviously that means now actively seeking professional help throughout my journey, and, having some safe, trusted adults who are equipped with that, sort of those skills, and, that it's a transactional relationship and it's consensual and it's not just unloaded off to someone. And that might not mean a friend, but that's okay. But also when going into spaces like this, for example, podcasts where I'm actively asked about my lived experience, then beforehand I'm writing notes down and making sure that what I'm saying is not scripted, but I know not to steer away from that. And, even going to events, or unless it's a really safe space that I know that everyone's well informed on similar circumstances, then I'm now treading lightly, and that's okay. And it means that also I'm not exposing too much of my whole self on the internet, in person, that I still keep my identity, parts of my identity safely with me where appropriate to do so. And I think I'm reconnecting with my emotional feelings. And I think it's beautiful as humans that we have the ability to feel deeply. And I've realised that I don't want to lose that again. So, which I kind of lost a little bit last year and the year before through detaching myself a bit too much to my boundaries and my emotions. But yeah, and as I suppose a last tip for anyone listening, I am starting journaling now, which I never thought I would be able to do. Usually I've given up quite easily, but I've started to like name my emotions throughout the day and sort of thread back where they've come from, or perhaps what sort of triggered me to feel happy or sad, or maybe a bit more deep in thought or out of the present moment. And by going back through those journals, I've started to notice a pattern, so that's been really helpful. But obviously that's just a bit of friendly advice, but take it how it resonates.
I love that. And I love how you are doing like and journaling and writing down things and really like thinking about it, but also just letting it out. And I think it's such an amazing tool and for your own mental health, but also just in general to feel like a safe space with that journal and just write your feelings. I'm gonna definitely do, I think, a bit more. Write things down in a journal and express myself a bit more. I think I sometimes don't do that. I sometimes just never write things down, or maybe something I'm been feeling. If maybe I want to write something that's been worrying me, because I keep it in and then it kind of explodes.
Yeah, I feel that I am.
So I think that's what I'm gonna be doing a bit more on. But thank you just so much for like sharing like other barriers that you face. I think it's so important. I think it's really very honest. So thank you.
Thank you.
And so what are the three issues you think people are facing at the moment? And what do you think our professionals and government ministers need to do better in supporting our voice?
Yeah, this was it's quite a big question, and I think I wanted to answer that. Young people are facing like almost a kaleidoscope of issues, and this has been intensified by years, nearly over a decade now of austerity, where there's been cuts to, for example, youth sector or education sector or social care sector, where young people, their lives are captured by, almost every day. And also for some young people and different groups of young people, there's even more identities attached to those things. So it's more amplified and exacerbated in their life. For example, we can talk about the cost of living. For some young people, obviously, that they're being impacted by that. But then if you're already in a low income working class where your family's on, accessing government benefits and you're on free school meals, then that will feel even worse than maybe other groups of young people. When you bring in sort of queerness or disability or race into that, it's really hard to identify like three totally sort of big issues right now, because I think all of us are experiencing it to different levels and different extent. And that's why I think we have to be a lot more aware of those things and not just see our own lived experiences and what we're feeling as everything, but actually through our own lived experiences notice that in other people and be curious about how others are experiencing these things. But I know that I do have to answer to some extent your question, so I do have a couple of thoughts on like more specific issues. I definitely think living increasingly through digital spaces at the moment, I've noticed a huge shift in not only the way I access information, but my peers, through multiple different networks, how we're becoming even more exposed to AI, and that's not just ChatGPT and using that, to write something, or hearing about AI in school, for example, for kids to use, but also just, for example, when we're scrolling on Instagram or on Google, there's now built-in AI, sort of generative AI, and you can't really notice when that's happening anymore, and it's really hard for us to turn it off. And obviously this is impacting our critical thinking, which is like one of the most fundamental sort of human experiences. And then also how information is understood. Like there's a reason why, it's all part of the same system. We're living more through digital spaces, but then we're being influenced more by misinformation. And this has also been exacerbated by AI and not knowing what is true or not. And also when we're accessing the news nowadays, I'm trying to shift towards reading the news more intentionally via newspaper as opposed to trying to follow news on Instagram, because I noticed that my opinions were being formulated so quickly that actually when I came to build that opinion and share that opinion. I didn't actually know the evidence behind it. So that's one definitely big key issue I'm noticing is shifting at the moment. But also the National Youth Strategy was launched a month ago, which, was the first time in nearly 20 years. And that made a huge statement and sort of promise for the next 10 years for young people. But I think it really was quite, I would say, quite shallow in how it referenced to and reflected on the impact of the cuts to the youth sector since 2010. And actually, those young people that have grown up from 2010 onwards don't actually have many third spaces anymore or trusted adults because of the result of those cuts back in 2010. And if you're born from 2016 onwards or 2020 onwards during COVID, you're then born not only through COVID where there's no social belonging, but then you're also born into an era of increasingly digital age and AI, which links back to my first point. So really you have no concept of that you should have the access to physical spaces. And that's really scary. At least my age, I'm sort of in between. I've felt some physical space in my childhood, but it's scary to see that being taken away from me in front of my eyes. So I think lastly, just to finish up on that question about the key issues, like I said, there's so many issues going around and it's really easy to feel destabilised and ungrounded during this time. But I think something that can really ground us and unify us and can be applied to everyone's life, all young people, is actually using more rights-based language as an everyday tool to express sort of what we should be having access to and holding accountability to, it could be, your local school, or it could be a council, or it could be government, or it could just be, the right to access, for example, Instagram without feeling like, you're being harmed in any way. I feel like when I've travelled recently to other countries across Europe, I've noticed a huge rights-based language approach in young people our age. They use it as everyday language. It's not unfamiliar. By doing so, they sounded more firm. They sounded like they knew a lot more about what they should access. They felt a lot more grounded and passionate. And I fear that because we are in an age where we don't really use rights-based language at the moment, particularly in England, that is, I know Scotland might be different, it means we don't feel that empowered anymore to hold people account or know that actually, you know what, a youth strategy is a good thing, but it shouldn't have needed to happen because the youth sector shouldn't have been cut in the first place, because that is our right to access those spaces. It's not an option for young people, it's a right for them to access. It's a community right, it's not just young people either. So for professionals and for anyone listening to this, I really wish that we can use more rights-based language and learn more about our rights, both as children and as adults, our human rights, and also just reconnecting with our empathy so that we see the humanity around us and sort of keep collaborating and mobilising together. I really hope that we don't lose that this year.
I agree with what you said about that. For them to actually understand that, like young people are very much at the heart and centre in what we do, and we have both those experience. And we shouldn't have had to do the National Youth Strategy because it really should have been in place. But I'm so glad that people had time and also had that passion to actually do that, to very much champion for what we want and what we believe in. And I completely agree on the issues that you were saying about AI, because that is a big thing. Social media is a big thing at the moment. And sometimes it's quite scary going on social media because sometimes you might feel judged for what you put out.
Yes.
Especially with the work and what we do in youth social action. Yes. Sometimes it feels like we can't have a say because someone's going to judge it, someone's going to hate it.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have better support in that, but also better understanding of how we can navigate it, and without feeling the fear of not going on social media, but also with AI, and try and work out how we can use AI in a positive way, not a negative way.
Exactly, and I think ultimately having the choice to access it.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more on that one. And so thank you so much for that. And so what would be an advice to a young person who might be doing youth social action but don't know how to?
Yeah, I think reflecting on my own journey and kind of what I've explained today, I think if you're listening to this and you're starting off and you don't really know where you exist in the world, firstly, I would say don't worry about labelling your social action or building a public profile for yourself. That is not the purpose, right? I think I'm guilty of it. There's been times when I've thought that I need to post something to feel validation, like we've just said, Troy, particularly in this space, and it almost feels competitive. But ultimately, if you're out in the community or, even doing something small, that's what matters the most. And You know, no one is here to judge you on what is the best practice for you, because at the end of the day, picking up a piece of litter and changing that small environment is something really powerful in itself. So that's the first piece. I'd also like to say, reflecting on your lived experience and your values and seeing where they connect and sort of your why. Obviously, I've had to find that out sort of some hard ways when I've been questioned and queried about it and I hadn't actually thought about it. And it's taken me a few years. But I would definitely say, if you're struggling to start up something or struggling to find out like where you exist or which community you want to be involved in, really thinking and taking time intentionally to think about your values and your lived experience and seeing how they connect to existing campaigns already is really useful. And I say that because going into youth advocacy, social action, social justice space is really hard, a lot. And it's not to say that you shouldn't be involved, because we need more young people to exist and reimagine these spaces with us. But I definitely think that it's better to have a community infrastructure around you as opposed to doing it alone. And that could be you building it yourself. I've known amazing people, for example, like Troy, who have built their own communities because, you know, it didn't exist for them or for you. So not to say that you don't have the skills or can't do it, but just if you have access to a community that exists, that would be the best step. For example, is really important there. And then lastly, I think don't start too big. I mean, I'm definitely one to talk. I've definitely burnt myself out through thinking I need to go and change all parts of the world, all social action and social justice space, even if I didn't have lived experience of it. And I think that's important. I definitely think it's important to be aware of those things and to see how they join up. But it's not your responsibility to solve every problem. So perhaps don't start too big. Or if you do, at least have that infrastructure around you and sort of a plan. And don't overcommit yourself. Trying and exploring different interests, different social action is totally okay. And you always can say no. You don't have to sign up to everything that's given to you. And that, again, is something that I'm practicing this year. If you're listening to this, I might be, an avid youth social actioner the last 5 years, even more than that, the last 10 years. But I'm still learning, and I'm learning about myself every day. And I think the best moments of me feeling most intentional is when I'm most grounded and actually thinking about what I want to do, as opposed to just doing it straight away. Those are my few tips.
I love that advice, and I really hope listeners can take away on what you said. And I absolutely resonate with all of what you said, actually, about just having that balance and also that boundary just to say no. Because yes, sometimes we want to do so much, we want to make that difference in maybe the education system, climate change and disability rights, but in reality we can't change everything, and there's the small things we can change, and the little things we can change is more better than the big thing all the time, because it can be overwhelming.
100%.
To finish off this episode, what would be a Forgotten Generation podcast quote to sum up your journey?
Quote would be, never forget where you came from. Your story and your lived experience is your superpower. Your roots built your resistance, brick by brick.
I absolutely love that quote, and I hope listeners do as well. So thank you so much, Molly, for coming on today's episode and to kickstart season 3.
Thank you so much, Troy. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm really excited to see how this goes and listen to season 3 episodes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to the podcast episode. This is a Be the Change Media Network production. Please support the podcast by subscribing and rating the podcast. I'd love to hear what you like and what could be better for future episodes. If you want to find me, you can find me on Instagram and iwill.troy, and also on X, iwill_Troy. Tune in to next week's episode.